Tshepo, we've recently highlighted some of the FRC's proposed changes to FRS 102, one of which is the introduction of a new 5-step model for revenue recognition. Can you give us a bit more detail about what's meant by this 5-step model?
Sure, Kelly. So this model is based on the FRS 15 5-step model, which provides a structured process with specific criteria which must be fulfilled for an entity to recognize its revenue, with appropriate simplifications in some scenarios. So the idea is just to recognize revenue as and when the control of the goods and services is transferred to the customer, rather than when the risks and rewards are transferred. So in summary, clients will need to review the contracts they have with their customers, identify each promise and understand what they've promised to do, determine a transaction price for this contract, and then allocate that transaction price to each promise made under the contract. Then the final step would be to recognize the revenue as and when the client satisfies each of these promises under the contract.
It all sounds quite complex on paper. Presumably certain sectors will be more impacted than others.
Exactly. And that impact will vary depending on the company's contracts and their complexity, as well as the industry that it operates in. So in the retail or hospitality industry, where we tend to see more straightforward contracts, simple promises, for example, the sale of consumables, there may be minimal change, if any. Whereas in sectors such as software, technology, or telecommunications, we might see a bit more significant impact. And that's because contracts in these sectors tend to be more complex, involving various deliverables or long-term arrangements, and in some cases can have multiple promises. So take, for example, a contract that includes the sale of hardware equipment, installation, and the maintenance services. In these scenarios, clients will need to unbundle these obligations into separate promises. So, when the client delivers and installs this piece of equipment, they will recognize the revenue associated with that promise as and when it is satisfied. Whereas for the maintenance services, the associated revenue may need to be spread over the life of the contract and recognized accordingly.
So I guess from what I hear and what we've all seen previously with the implementation of IFRS 15 itself, it really does depend on the specific terms of a client's contracts with its customers. You mentioned that there are some simplifications available compared to the full IFRS 15 model.
Yes, there are a few. And the objective here is not to introduce complexities for the sake of complexities, right? In some cases, there are a few practical expedients or simplifications. For example, companies can combine similar contracts and then apply a portfolio approach for recognizing revenue, as opposed to recognizing that revenue on an individual contract-by-contract basis.
And presumably the new model will have implications beyond the statutory financial statements. What considerations or potential stakeholder impacts should reporters be mindful of?
Sure. So stakeholders should look at the impact that this will have on key performance indicators, such as sales targets, EBITDA, incentives, or other bonus structures that are linked to these revenue figures. So this may also have an impact on the contract negotiations, pricing strategies, or the disclosure requirements that an entity has, such as debt covenants or interest covers.
So it really is essential then for clients to consider the wider ramifications of this model, and sooner rather than later. Any suggestions how they might get started?
Exactly. So clients can get started by looking at the potential impact on the financial statements, accounting policies, and also the general operations. And this involves a detailed review of the existing contracts, as well as probably the revenue streams. So in some cases, clients will also need to carefully evaluate the obligations under the contracts, or promises as they would now be referred to, and probably structure them a bit more effectively for themselves.
Thanks, Tshepo. Some great advice there and definitely some food for thought. Next time, we'll take a deeper dive into the specifics of the new leasing model. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Tshepo, myself, or another member of the accounting advisory team.